Welcome to the Better Stack podcast, where we have conversations about software development, AI, and all sorts of new technology. I'm one of your hosts, Andres, and today I am joined by
James
and Alex.
Hey, Alex. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So let's start off with the company that you run. It is called Hookdeck. So for those who are not familiar, what is Hookdeck? What does it do? Tell us more about it.
I like to think of it as the Webhook company that's trying to kill Webhooks. That's probably a story that we can get into. But we build kind of two main products. One is the Event Gateway. So the Event Gateway is served as kind of like a specialized event bus for all events that are coming from outside your infrastructure. Webhooks is a prime suspect, but we see a lot of kind of like IoT and SDK-based use cases and so on. So basically, we provide kind of like untrusted endpoint. You can send any events to, and then all the capabilities to manage those events. So that goes from like filtering, transformation, routing, queuing, alert and issue management, replays, kind of like the whole thing. So really it's covering both kind of like the interoperability in the sense that I need to receive events and webhooks from all the vendors I work with, right? That might be Stripe, Shopify, Twilio, WhatsApp, TikTok, whatever, you name it. They each have their own kind of like criterias and quirks and specific requirements that they have. And so we can kind of like standardize all that and bring that into a single contract, and then everything from the kind of queuing standpoint. And so if, for instance, like Shopify, there's like a flash sale on your store and you get like just absolutely swarmed, like stampede with events, we normalize that so you can control the throughput and the event gateway and all that. So that's a big part of it. It's kind of like the consumer side, and that's where really the Hookdeck story kind of began. And more recently, we also released Outpost. Outpost is fully open source, Apache 2.0 project, and we now have a managed service for it as well, and it's to send events. And so it's kind of like the other side of the equation, right? It's you as a publisher, as a platform, a dev tool, or really at this point, kind of like everyone is also sending events. I'm surprised every day. And so Outpost is this managed service or self-hosted service that you can use to like declare who your tenants are, what the destinations, the endpoints that they have registered, configure topics, and kind of publish events to them, and it handles everything from observability, metrics, delivery guarantees, retries, and kind of like all the usual suspects around like signature rotation, and all that. The little kind of like joke I was making about trying to kill webhooks is that Outpost, yes, allows you to send webhooks, but also allows you to publish events directly to your user's message bus. And so Outpost natively supports what is kind of now known as event destinations. And so Webhook is thought as the transport rather and so you're basically like sending events over webhooks, and webhooks is a transport mechanism, right? And you can choose new transport protocols, things like MQ for RabbitMQ or Kafka, and we support like publishing directly also to all the usual suspects, so like PubSub, SQS, AWS EventBridge, and then obviously the Hookdeck Event Gateway, right? So I kind of like to think of it as the better destination, but we'll see if people believe it is.
So you said you want to kill webhooks. So I imagine this idea in its inception came from the fact that you were all tired of webhooks, or it was too hard to manage. Like, tell us about how you came up with the idea.
Yeah, I was just telling the story actually to someone the other day. Like 5 or so years ago, I published this article in Medium. I'm probably coming on 6 years now, and the article is titled, and playing right off to what you're saying. Webhook sucks, but there's something you can do about it. And that was just like me in my basement, like messing around and building kind of like a V1 kind of like prototype of Hookdeck. But it very much like came from that frustration. I was personally working in e-commerce, and we built like a lot of custom kind of software to power the e-commerce, from like custom subscription management to warehousing and fulfillment and all that sort of stuff. And just like so many of your issues boiled down to webhooks. And it was almost kind of like a recurring joke, because like on one part I was trying to like sell was women fashion business, right? I was trying to sell like oisery and like nylons and stuff. And then on the other end, it's like, where the hell is the sorter webhook and what happened to it? It just like felt like very mismatched in terms of concerns. And so it very much like came from that. I just like, I'm frustrated as the consumer of those webhooks that there's no real kind of like batteries included, way of dealing with this problem. And if you went online and kind of like search for a recommendation, like there's like, I mean, like webhooks are not new. Like at the end of the day, it's HTTP requests. There's obviously like patterns established around how you're supposed to deal with this. But then like you very quickly go down the rabbit hole. Okay, you need like your ingestion consumers that can like auto scale, and then you need to queue into a queue like SQS, and then you need to deploy a set of consumers that are going to consume from like SQS. And then if something goes wrong, it's going to end up in the Delaware queue, and then you need like some script to be able to recover from the Delaware queue and understand why things ended up in there in the first place. And there's just like all those concerns. And as complexity grows up, you also want to be able to like replay historical events that you've received. You want to be able to like see what specifically the payload of a webhook was. And then you start dealing with the different vendors, because like maybe Stripe is going to give you a UI, and then Intercom is not going to give you a UI, and then you like have all those like different quirks that you have to deal with. And so it very much like stemmed from that frustration. It's just like, why is there no solution to this, right? And at first I was looking at it very much from like an observability standpoint, and it didn't really work. The part that I kind of miss is that observability is only really one part of it. Ultimately, you have this saying I call kind of like webhooks the gateway drug to event-driven architecture. And the reason for this is, and it's really also why I like to insist on the term event rather than webhook, is that behind every webhook, there's an event, and there's now event-driven architecture paradigms that come like packaged with that webhook, right? And so every time that you receive webhook for any serious scale or level of kind of like critical use cases, you now have to think about indemnitancy, ordering, delivery guarantees, and kind of like all the type of challenge that you have once you start dealing with like asynchronous event-driven programming paradigm. And so really like a lot of what we built kind of evolved into like building a full-fledged queue at the end of the day. So there's this interoperability layer, sure, that's for dealing with events, but then all those kind of like semantics are more around dealing with events and pub subsystems and so on in general. And we came from a place of not trying to reinvent queues. I think we like stumbled on a bunch of like pretty genuinely cool ideas. And one thing that we're seeing now is there's actually people are just like moving to Hookdeck to like swap out pub sub or SQS from their stack, which to me is kind of mind-boggling, because like we don't run your VPC and all that sort of stuff. I think there's a lot of issues with that. Maybe an int at the roadmap. But the point is I think there's like a lot of semantics around event-driven architecture that people have kind of just like grown accustomed to, and no one really questioned. And it's like, why are we doing Delaware queues again? Like, the fuck is wrong with that? Because I don't know anybody that thinks like Delaware queue is like a convenient semantic for dealing with errors in your queues, right? So anyway, and I'm happy to like maybe touch on some of those things, because there's a couple of strong opinions in there. I don't know how much you guys are nerds of PubSub and event-driven architecture. I don't want to drag you too far into it.
I feel like, yeah, my understanding of dead letter queues and all that stuff is very, very minimal. Like some of the things I'm hearing today, I hear for the first time.
Yeah.
No, I was gonna say mine's quite surface level as well, but I've dealt with webhooks a fair bit and dealt with some of the problems you mentioned.
And I think like, and that's how you guys are kind of making the point for this webhooks, the gateway drug to event-driven architecture, because I'm willing to bet that for kind of developers of your background, webhooks is probably the first exposure that you've had to, wait, this is async, how do I deal with this, right? And I think there's this like whole like learning curve, right? It's like the classic like iceberg, where it's like, you have the HTTP request that comes in, then like, you know, the rest of the iceberg behind the kind of like in the water, right? And I think like one of the things that I'm trying to do is kind of like bring a level of DX that hasn't really been achieved in that space, so that you don't actually have to like figure out the rest of the iceberg, right? There's some things that are a little bit inevitable. Like I don't want to misrepresent it. Like I think once you start working with those sorts of problems, like you need to have good understanding of indemnitancy, for instance. You need to have like good understanding of like ordering guarantees. So like it's not like you can solve every problem. I think like you're still dealing with events at the end of the day. But I think there's a lot of the semantics and complexity that is mainly coming from not like fully thought through tooling, more so than like, you know, genuine complexity associated with like that problem space. So I think right now, like with Hookdeck, we end up like serving kind of two sorts of customers. We end up serving the customers that like really know the problem and in depth, and like will, you know, do solution engineering around like their current like Kafka setup and all that sort of stuff like all day long. And then, you know, we pitch them on some of those new semantics and they're really excited by it. That's like one category. But the other category is like I don't want to actually have to learn any of this, right? And basically like try to like kind of sidestep this whole thing, right? So we see kind of a lot of like those two profiles.
Is that also a reason why you open source this tool Outpost to make it easier for developers to start with using that?
In some ways. The other way is because like we don't need Outpost to make money.
Okay.
And so we're like, I guess we should just open source it then.
Yeah, it's just I know that a lot of our YouTube audience really like knowing about new open source tools. That's why I just, wanted to ask about that as well.
So first of all, I kind of regret a little bit, like in the early days of Hookdeck, not taking like a bit more of an open source first approach. And I think there's a lot of things that how you end up like building your software that's very different when you're building for kind of closed source versus open source. But coming to the open source kind of decision, I think one thing you're seeing kind of like with venture back like startups and that sort of stuff is that you end up like with those like kind of fake open source, right? It's like open source, but either it's like open core or like, yes, it's open source, but like they really don't want you to use the open source, or they end up like having to relicense around kind of like not true open source licenses and that sort of stuff, right? And I think that got me really excited for Outpost and open source is that I felt like we had an opportunity to have the right incentives. Now, maybe we get a little bit into the weeds of how we think about kind of like the business and that sort of stuff. But in my mind, people that have to receive webhooks kind of like on the consumer side is at least 2 to 3 orders of magnitude more than people that need to send a webhook, right? Because like, think about it. If I send webhooks, I'm sending it to all my customers, and my customers might be, 10 if you're just starting, 100, like 1,000, 2 million, right? And so inevitably, like the consumer side is just a lot more people. And so when I'm thinking about it more from like an entrepreneur point of view, I'm more excited about the business opportunity on the consumer side, right? But I think what we realize though is obviously you don't have consumers without good producers. And I think there's more and more demand for webhooks kind of like in general across apps that you develop. And so like also more people want to offer it and don't want to go through like the headaches and the overhead and so on. But from my perspective, first, like sending webhooks is just a simpler problem because you control the parameters, while on the receiving side, you don't. The vendor gets to dictates what the parameters are. So it tends to be, I don't want to say it's like simple, but like it's, and there's definitely like a bunch of ways you can do this wrong. But I think in terms of like problem space, it's definitely more limited on the producer side and on the consumer side. And then second, like our job, I think, is to encourage producing of events. And that's the thing that we ultimately care about because we want more people to consume those webhooks and eventually potentially be customers and that sort of stuff, right? And so I think that puts us in a position where we can like truly say, look, if you're going to use Outpost, whether you open source it or you deploy it with Hookdeck on the managed version, it generally doesn't matter for us. Like we're accomplishing kind of like the business goal either way, right? And so like that alignment incentive got me really excited. And I think there's a couple of things that we did. First, like we released the open source before even considering building a managed version. Like there was generally no plan to build a managed version when we build the open source, and the open source project has been published about like 2 years ago at this point. So took us almost like 2 years before enough people were asking for the managed version that we ended up building it. So that's one part. And the other part as well is the managed version of Outpost runs the exact same Docker build that's being published on Docker Hub from the open source kind of build step, right? In the sense that we don't have a private fork, we're not packaging features and so on outside the open source. We're truly running exactly the same Docker build. And so like the question for you is not like, oh, does it offer feature X or Y, whatever in either version? It's literally just, do you want to deploy it and have to take care of the operational burden associated with that, or do you want to pay someone else to do it for you, right? And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. That depends on every business, their level of comfort, their stack, their compliance requirements, kind of like you name it, right? But because of that, I feel like we can be good contributors to the open source community with that project. And yeah, I've been very glad to work on it because it's the first kind of like big open source project that I'm involved in, like, outside of like here and there contributions and that sort of stuff, but as like a core maintainer. And so, yeah, no, it's been good.
How have you found the open source world now that Claude Code and that lot exist? Have you had a lot of PRs and security vulnerabilities that aren't real, or has it been okay to manage?
Look, I don't think we're at a scale where I can speak to what other people are experiencing. So I definitely don't want to like misrepresent the situation because it definitely sounds bad out there for a lot of folks. I will say that I've been surprised by the quality of some of the contribution we've had, but we've definitely also had contributions where there's this like one specific PR, I think it's still open in the repo right now, which is to add Cloudflare queues as a destination, because like one of the supported event destinations. All good on the surface, right? Description sounds good on the PR and that sort of stuff, but then when you actually dig through the code, it's like using a bunch of like completely made up Cloudflare APIs.
And they didn't double check it, just...
I mean, clearly the person that opened the PR didn't even actually try to run it, right?
Yeah.
And so now the burden is kind of on us of like, okay, now that there's this open PR, because obviously I'm like slightly concerned about being perceived as we're like not trying to like encourage people that we could like be seen as competing with. So I do think like we should add Cloudflare queues and that sort of stuff. But at the same time, like it was on the closed roadmap, like no one else other than this person asked for it and that sort of stuff, right? And now it's like in this half-baked state where it's like, okay, if you close it, you look like you don't want to support people that could be perceived as competitors, right? But then do you actually like dedicate resources and like move up your roadmap and that sort of stuff to like make sure you implement it correctly, right? So it's been a bit of a catch-22 with those sorts of situations. But so far I feel like it's been a really good experience, and especially because we use the same build. One thing that we've like kind of taken too is whenever customers kind of reach out for feedback or they talk to us about like specific features and so on, we open issues in GitHub or we point to like existing PRs, existing issues and that sort of stuff. And like we kind of make sure to always try to like have people know, hey, by the way, the repo's there and you can go and contribute. And like actually to that point, we've had several kind of like managed users make contribution and basically just like go and implement their own features, right? And I think it did reduce the barrier to entry tremendously for those sorts of kind of like genuine use cases for contributions, because historically the projects in Go, most of our users probably aren't Go developers in the first place, right? Like we see a lot of Python, TypeScript, obviously like Node.js, like type, and so there's a barrier entry for Go, and then also just like learning a new project to contribute is like non-trivial, right? And so I think it did reduce that barrier to entry substantially, and that's really good, because now if as a user you're taking with this like need of like, oh, this thing like really bothers me, and plus like as a maintainer that's such a strong signal that this feature is worth building, someone like goes out of their way and spends their wordy tokens on implementing this, like it's a signal that like, okay, this actually matters, right, in terms of like stack ranking, like what's most important. So I think like reducing that barrier to entry is really good. And so I think if you can manage to get out of the floodgates of spam and all that sort of stuff, there's a lot of positive to it.
In the landing page, one thing that really stuck out to me was a testimonial from the CEO of Vercel. So Vercel is actually using Hookdeck as well as a product.
That if you read that specific quote, like he's recommending it to
okay,
kind of like Vercel users and that sort of stuff. But there's actually kind of a funny story there, because Guillermo kind of tweeted about it on a Saturday night. I had no idea it was coming. I don't really have a prior relationship with Guillermo and that sort of stuff, and it can speak to the influence of like some of the people in the community, because like the amount of just like sign up and awareness and so on that we got from that was like insane. Since then, like Guillermo and I have been kind of in touch here and there, and it's like always been like good chats and all that. And it's interesting because actually, if you look at a company like Vercel, one thing that Guillermo was telling me is that he's actually like seeing a lot more people using Webhooks now. And his read on it was that it's mainly driven by LLM adoptions, and that's creating new use cases for data you usually wouldn't have cared about before. Like kind of think of your customer support system, for instance. You have like your agents and like humans that are in there, and like there's very little reason to like do anything with new tickets event and that sort of stuff, because like anyways it's like the human that's going to go and answer that message. But now we're obviously like in a world where that's completely changing, and when you move from humans triggering the agents, like what trigger agents, it's events. Right? And suddenly now you care about events from your customer support system and your marketing tool and your blah, 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 right? And so that's definitely something that I think as platforms they're seeing, and like that's been kind of like interesting discussion points for us, obviously. But yeah, no, it's Vercel specifically, just to clarify, not directly a user. I mean, I'm sure a bunch of developers use like your local CLI and that sort of stuff at Vercel, but yeah.
So what is the typical customer for someone using Hookdeck? Like if I had, I don't know, a small size t-shirt e-commerce shop or something, how would I use Hookdeck for it? And would it make sense to use it in this case?
Probably not.
Okay.
You're asking me kind of like the, $1 million question, in the sense that I think it's something we've always very struggled, in the sense that like the breadth of reasons why you'd use webhooks or depends on webhooks is just like insanely large. Like we get webhooks from, usual suspect like Stripes and Shopify, but we also have like webhooks coming from like all the Australian telecom providers and the UK clearinghouse, and there's actually a bunch coming from like the EVE Online game. There's also like apparently a community of people still playing this like Conan the Barbarian game like from like 15 years ago or something, and like they're big on webhooks too. Don't ask me why, right? But the point is like there's this like breadth that's like very hard to capture in saying like this is our customer, right? And so like when we look at people that use Hookdeck, there's no single use case or group or whatever that's like maybe more than 10%. But coming to your e-commerce use case or like example, so first of all, like a small t-shirt store probably hasn't built like custom apps and that sort of stuff that would rely on it. But they almost certainly have installed apps. Like for instance, like an app to collect reviews, and an app maybe for back in stock notifications, and an app for inventory management, and an app with their 3PL. And like all those guys are almost exclusively relying on webhooks, right? So if I want to send a back in stock notification, what I'm doing, I'm listening to all the stock updates in the Shopify store through their webhooks. And then as soon as a product that was previously out of stock now is stock, I'm like, okay, gotta send the email, right? And so basically every single thing they're going to install or add and so on is going to rely on webhooks behind the scene. And so like, that's definitely like one big category. People are building like apps, and it's not just Shopify, obviously. Like Stripe, for instance, as like a big apps marketplace, and a bunch of these are customers, that sort of stuff. The other thing we'll see is big stores, like think like the Gymshark and like the Good Americans and the Rogue and that sort of stuff, where they have their own technical teams and they're building custom apps. They're building custom apps for their system integration, often like very operational in terms of like sequencing of when an order needs to be synced with a 3PL and needs to be adding note, and maybe there's like customer specific preferences that needs to be added to that data before it reaches 3PL, that sort of stuff, right? And some of it's going to power kind of user experiences, things like custom subscription management, or specific emails that you want to send when someone buys a gift card and wants to send it to their friend, and like all that sort of stuff. And so that's what we tend to see. Like the small Shopify store is probably like the one you could have picked that we don't see a lot of people using webhooks for, but almost everywhere else you aim kind of like in that segment, you're gonna land on a company that uses webhooks.
Fair enough.
How does it compare to something like AWS EventBridge? Because that's sort of one of the other choices that I've heard of. Is it just better developer experience, or?
Well, obviously we all know AWS went into, like better stack is more or less making the same case, right?
Yeah.
And so whatever you guys say in kind of like your unique selling point versus, CloudWatch and Amazon log services and all that sort of stuff kind of like carry over. And that's very much like the developer experience like argument, right? Like proper APIs and MCP and nice UI and like rock solid observability and all that sort of stuff, right? And obviously like the integration of it, I think like the AWS problem is always that you end up with like 20 services, most of which you probably forgotten the name by now. And then kind of like the data is like sparsely through this, and the configuration is sparsely through it and all that, right? So that's one point. But I think the broader point is AWS EventBridge doesn't actually integrate with everybody. So like the vendor needs to have like integrated with AWS EventBridge. There's ways that you can work around that with like with the API gateway and blah, blah, blah. But so the point is like, it's very much built for the AWS ecosystem, where most of the use cases are actually like internal events to AWS, like things like a new S3 document was uploaded and that sort of stuff. And then the interoperability with the third party, while they do support like 40 odd, like whatever vendor, don't quote me on this, might have been updated by now, but not thousands. You always end up in the scenario where, okay, well, Shopify supports EventBridge, but then like Twilio doesn't. Right. And so you end up with those issues where you can't actually like bring an agnostic solution that just like works across the board. And so I think like that's one thing we're trying to do, right? It's like build this in such a way that like we don't need the vendor to opt in or be okay with it or actually do anything on their end. And to that point, the way that we're building Hookdeck, I think, is like fairly novel in the sense like it purely works over HTTP. And so the idea is we provide you with a URL and you can replace your existing webhook URL with the URL that we provided you. And then in Hookdeck, your destination is what would have been your Hookdeck URL. And so we kind of work as a push-based queue in between that. And so we'll get all the webhook through HTTP, and then we'll push those out at the rate that you specify to your own endpoint. But what that means is that you don't even need to redeploy your code. You can be on any cloud, on any stack for this to work kind of basically right away, right? Because really the only requirement is to update the URL at the end of the day. And that's like kind of a far cry from AWS EventBridge, which is like ultimate vendor lock-in, needs specific compatibility, only works in AWS ecosystem. Yeah, but I usually think of AWS EventBridge as kind of like the other big event gateway. We actually are seeing Azure EventGrid, which is like a competitor, also like have gained some ground. And so when I think of like our most direct competition, or really like our inspiration in some ways, it's those two products. But I definitely think like the scope of what we're trying to do is like quite a bit larger. And for some people it's a good thing. For some people it's not a good thing, right? Like for some people that's what they want. Like, you know, they're fully ingrained in the AWS ecosystem, they're using CloudFormation, they're familiar with all the services, they want to be able to pick and choose the capabilities. And you know, that's fine. Like, I don't think we're ever going to have 100% market share. So actually, really, when you're competing with AWS, I think a couple of percentage points is probably all you need, right? So
yeah.
So yeah, I think we're trying to make the case that, you know, for a set of companies and developers and so on, that's going to be the right solution. And, you know, for others, AWS EventBridge is going to be in, and that's fine.
So a thing that I've noticed in the past year is that the amount of downtimes for like big companies have been increasing. Like there's all these memes of like GitHub being down. And I remember like 2 years ago when I was working, like the P99, if it would drop like to 99.5 or something or lower, like you would have a serious conversation with your team. Like, how can you make this happen? Right, now it's
kind of par for the course.
Yeah, and now it's like people have kind of gotten used to like GitHub being down for such a long time. So I'm thinking, like, from your perspective on Hookdeck, are you seeing that there's also a lot more downtimes this year than previous years, and how do you deal with those challenges?
Yeah, that's interesting, because obviously it's a consideration you have to do if you're going to consume webhooks from actually GitHub. Webhooks specifically are particularly problematic. You know, there's like a chance out of two if you log in on like Railway or Vercel, whatever, there's going to be a little banner. It's like, you know, deployments are down because like GitHub webhooks don't work or whatever. And actually, like the GitHub CTO made this like blog post like on their infrastructure stability, kind of in the midst of all the memes and all that sort of stuff, trying to like temper it down. I don't think it really worked, but there was an attempt. But like one of the things that was explicitly blaming in this article was like webhook stability and how it depends on like MySQL and like blah blah blah, right? And to their credit, just because I think the way I've maybe been phrasing this is a bit dismissive, like I really don't doubt that just their infrastructure challenge is completely insane with the rise of agents. Like the same way we're talking about those OSS maintainers getting flooded, that's also the GitHub infrastructure getting flooded, that, right? And so I'm sure that's like extremely difficult challenge. But the point I'm getting at, where I'm leading to, is that yes, we can see it, and not only that, like we do actually monitor it for some vendors. So for instance, we have this thing we call it Hookdeck Radar. But the idea is that we can look at aggregated statistics from all the customers and all the webhooks that we get through Hookdeck, and then calculate things like, you know, what the delivery latency is, like what the P99 delivery latency is for a vendor, what their uptime is, and that sort of stuff. So for instance, like, or Radar for Shopify is like quite popular. A couple hundred like subscribers for it. And so the idea is we send you alerts basically if the latency goes out like a certain like standard deviation of the baseline latency, right? I think in the case of Shopify, like the baseline latency is around like 4 or 5 seconds for a delivery. I think at like beyond like 10 seconds, right, we'll kind of send an alert. But the idea is you can like monitor this like a kind of like time series data and like look at what their uptime, not just in terms of like raw uptime, but also like their latency profile is over time. And that's definitely something that you see. And I mean, they're like specifically Shopify team is well aware of it, but you can see that there's a lot of variance in those delivery times. So there's going to be, you know, there's maybe once every 2 months or something like that, like a fairly like significant incident on latency. And I think that's something that usually you don't see, right? Because obviously like downtime is much easier. You go in your Datadog or in your Better Stack, how do you guys call it again? Like the metric product?
Observability?
observability. Yeah. So you go in your better stack observability and that sort of stuff, right? And like you look at like the HTTP calls to the webhook endpoint and just like stop dead. All right. Like, problem's pretty obvious and that's straightforward. But like if the latency creeps up to 60 seconds, now that's something that's going to be very difficult to tell from your actual like metrics, right? And so that's because that's not the latency that you take to process it, which is probably something you'd be, tracing and so on. But it's the delay on the vendor side. But now if you have any assumption in your code, your business operation and so on that assumes like, some real-timeness to those events, if they're now coming 60 seconds later, that can start introducing like a bunch of kind of like nuanced issues and bugs and bad assumptions and that sort of stuff in the code. So I think that's a place like we're maybe like a bit more uniquely positioned to be able to like kind of provide like aggregated data. And so you can know like, oh, is it me or is it my vendor, right? That's having issues. I don't know if I can comment like empirically on how much it's gone up or down. And there are the usual suspects that they GitHub and so on. That's kind of like easy to point finger at. I don't know if I would say that it's a genuinely distributed problem that we see all the time. I think it tends to be like more concentrated in specific vendors. And I think the part where people tend to get bit a bit more is on those delivery latencies. The other thing too is that like I think people assume that delivery latency is lower than it actually is in most vendors, because we're definitely talking a couple seconds in most cases, which depending on how you look at it might be a long time, might not be a long time, But I think when I show this like latency chart, for instance, Shopify to a bunch of Shopify developers, they have like a first like, ooh, like I did not expect that, right? Like there's kind of like breaking from expectation that happens.
I used to work for a fairly big e-commerce company, and we had the same problem. Like the latency is bad, but like everyone was like the Spider-Man meme pointing fingers at whose team is responsible for it, because usually it's basically a third-party vendor, like you said, and sometimes it's just nothing you can do. You just have to work around it. So it's cool.
Yeah,
that
and you want to be careful, like blaming the vendor too, right? Like I think it's something and obviously like in the context of what you guys do, it's kind of always a common problem. Whenever we have an incident, it's like, okay, how much quote-unquote blame do you put on the vendor? But at some point, there's also like what's being reasonable versus not reasonable, and what's a fluke versus not a fluke accident. Like for instance, the other day, Railway, so some of the Outpost managed deployments are running on Railway because their pricing structure, since we have to run the same version as the open source, we haven't built kind of like a multi-tenanted that wouldn't be relevant and like open source. So basically we do like actual deployment for every single customers, right? And so for free plan users, we'll kind of deploy an instance for them on Railway, which generally speaking like works pretty fine. But the other day, their GCP account got shut down, and then they were down for like 6 hours or something, right? And so then it's like, okay, can you not talk about it there's like one thing about like deflecting the blame, and I definitely like you have responsibility for your vendors, but the point is I think this line is pretty hard to walk, and I definitely see that there's like this natural tendency of people to like want to like point fingers because it kind of like de-responsibilize you, and so like you have to do like some fighting against that, right? And but in the cases where you can be sure that it's the vendor, I think it's like interesting to be able to like identify that and have the hard data around it, which is often a problem with vendor problems, right? You don't see their side of the data, and so it's very difficult to like say with any certainty or like empirical evidence that it is clearly them. You have to like derive it from your own data, which could be right, could be wrong, right? So
I was wondering, when there is an outage at something like Shopify or Stripe, how do the events play catch up, and does that hit your servers really hard?
Yeah, basically Rex mayhem is what happens. And I because there's those scenarios where like we always say that like you shouldn't assume like a specific webhook volume. So Webhook has this characteristic where every vendor is going to enforce like a timeout, right? They're going to give you like 3 seconds, 5 seconds, kind of depends on the platform to respond. And so that means like you can't really do any meaningful amount of work, especially when you account just for like network latencies and that sort of stuff in that delay, right? And so that's why, I mean, not just why, but it's like one of the reason why the common thing is you need to queue it. You can't like process that synchronously. But I lost my train of thought. Can you repeat your question?
I was talking about when there's an outage at a company like Stripe and Shopify.
Oh, yes.
And playing catch up.
Yeah. So anyway, all that to say, latency, blah, 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 convoluted way of saying, you need to be able to auto scale. And so you need to be able to auto scale in like a pretty short time frame. And those spikes are coming from multiple different reasons. It might just be kind of like naturally you did like a bulk import, or when your customer did a bulk import or whatever, right? There's other reason why spike would happen, but downtime is actually one of those, right? There's this moment where if Shopify went down for half an hour, by the time they recover, they're just gonna like plow through the backlog, especially that they're going to try to reduce the back pressure on their queue. So basically like work through everything that accumulated during the downtime. And so generally speaking, what you'll see is that they'll even scale higher than their usual capacity because they're trying to like catch up on it, right? And that results in basically just sending a bunch of requests to the end stores. And so, yes, you have those irregularities, but some of those irregularities in throughput are not caused by you. It's like 100% caused by the vendor because, vendor is going through his own infrastructure challenges and all that. And obviously, like Shopify capacity as sending webhooks is much higher than your capacity at receiving webhooks for the most part. Yeah, funny enough, actually, one of our investor was the CPO at Twilio, and I think that's part of the reason why I was interested in investing, because one of the things that he said is that basically like, Twilio was like routinely just DDoSing their customers, for all intents and purposes. And it's a little bit inevitable and kind of like part of like the problem of doing those like, vendor driven events. And so it's very much kind of like a well-known kind of like problem with vendors, and they know it too, because that's something you can track in the response latency from the servers too, right? If you DDoS your customer, server response latency goes up, and then at some point they start timing out. That problem compounds because it's harder to have more throughput if there's longer timeouts. Like basically the longer you have to hold up the HTTP connection, the less requests you can make per any given worker that you have on your end. And so then you have to scale, and then you send more because you scaled, and you're right, it just kind of like piles up together, right? It tends to be very self-reinforcing. Because basically the least capacity you have to process those webhooks, the faster the latency degrades, right? And so as you reach kind of like saturation on your server, then latency goes really bad, but those requests like keep piling up. And what a lot of vendors do is that at some point they'll just like disable your endpoint, because otherwise it's kind of keep building up, right? And they don't want to like be holding up hundreds of thousands of HTTP connections because your server is slow to respond. But then as soon as they disable it, then you lose the data. So that's the catch-22, right? So really ensuring kind of like a response time through those like variants that are often out of your control is a big part of the challenge there.
I also wanted to ask, with AI now, how is it changing the whole space of webhooks? I know that you said that like LLMs are now sending more webhooks and maybe processing them, but internally, like how do you use AI for Hookdeck, and what do you see as the future of AI in this space?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on that front. On like kind of obviously there's us as just a software development shop, and I'm sure like you guys are kind of like going through like the same challenges around workflows changing every week, and token costs, and how much is a reasonable amount of token cost, and
token
all that
maxing.
sort of stuff. Yeah. We don't have a leaderboard. I'm very afraid of the leaderboard idea. Seems like a surefire way to destroy your margins. But so a couple of thoughts. First, coming back to what I was saying earlier, there's growth and needs for events that are driven by those agentic use cases, because agents are moving from, being human triggered to event triggered, and you're seeing, all the cloud agent products and so on come out and that sort of stuff. And all of these are essentially triggered either by a schedule or by events at the end of the day. And some of those events are kind of like abstracted away from you, but there still are things like GitHub PR, or, a new commit or a new comment on GitHub. Like all of this is webhook driven. But obviously it's going to kind of like branch like way beyond that, like the customer support and the Slack and the blah, blah, blah. And even probably like real-time stuff that happens kind of like in the real world from like sensor data and all that sort of stuff, right? I think also a lot of agents will need to trigger events with other agents. Basically like the output of the agent is going to be an event, which is possibly going to trigger another agent, another company, and so on, which yes, you could kind of like describe as just another webhook use case, and it kind of is. But I think also like some of the semantics around webhooks right now are kind of flawed around like security and around like the protocol and the efficiency and that sort of stuff. And that's why we've been kind of like pushing event destinations as a better pattern and kind of like a more optimized pattern for this. The other thing too is if what you run in response to events is agentic workflows, which are undeterministic, can run for a long time, that sort of stuff, it makes it much harder to actually adjust your capacity and scale, kind of like in consequence to the events that you get. So I think throughput management and capacity management and all that becomes much more difficult. Your failure rates is going to be higher because of like just, Claude timing out and just your evals not passing and all that sort of stuff. So I think from a application building standpoint and like the core primitives that you want to use and where that runs and how long that runs for and how you deal with your back pressure and that sort of stuff, there's a lot of like new challenges there. And then in terms of us kind of like internally, I think we're still trying to figure out the right way. There's part of me that's just like completely blown away by capacity, and I'm not surprising anyone. Like, I don't think I'm bringing any like kind of unique insight there. The one thing I'll say though is that the bar between like going from, your CLI prompt or your codex or your whatever to actually shipping kind of like high quality, tasteful product, I think some of that nuance is still being lost in all the memes and all the X posts and that sort of stuff, where it's like, I have some doubts that you can actually spend that level of token and produce something that's actually value added to the world at the end of the day. And at least in our experience so far, obviously there's a lot of it around kind of like security, that's like massive enablers, code reviews and that sort of stuff. But I think when it comes to like those things are kind of like the table stakes. They're not the thing that like genuinely add value at the end of the day, right? Like when it comes to actually like building something very valuable that other derive value from, I feel there's still quite a gap there. And I feel like our team is still very responsible for like bringing that level of taste and insight and customer understanding and empathy and all that sort of stuff that you just don't get straight out of like the chat box. And so maybe we're the one being foolish and we could be moving a lot faster. And if we just kind of like one shot everything and ran with it. But right now our approach is still to keep that same level of expectations in terms of like the net output and what we deliver to the end user at the end of the day. Yes, obviously it means we can do more. And also I think more people that have that taste and that empathy and so on can bring value to the user, because the barrier was the code, right? And so for instance, like pretty much everyone in the company now, quote unquote, codes, right? Like our designer is like resident vibe coder now. He's the one like fully responsible for the website, but even does a bunch of like dashboard work and that stuff. Our product marketer, head of DevRel, like all, not token maxing, but, if there was a leaderboard, they're probably somewhere at the top. And I think that's a really good thing. It's enablers because those people have the kind of like critical thinking and all that I was describing, to be able to like ship like kind of tasteful end user things, and like the barrier is more the code. And so in some ways, I think like some of the largest benefit is coming from there more so than like kind of pure engineering. Again, not to say that the pure engineering is not getting a ton of value from it, but I think the bottleneck still remains on that taste. And plus I'm like spending so much time reviewing kind of pointless PRs now. It's like, there's the downside to it too, right? Like,
yeah, for sure. And the amount of code you have to review?
Yeah, and like let's take this obscure vulnerability that there's basically no chance, and like I'm not even sure it even qualifies as low, right? Yeah. But obviously once it's surfaced, it's like you feel a responsibility to it, and I think that's normal. But like at some point it's like, we've never had this many PRs open at any given point in time, and it's just like getting a little insane to really wrap your head around all of this. And I think like bringing the judgment as to like, it's not because you can do everything, you should do everything, right? And I think like it very much like comes with that LLM kind of like attitude. And I think like bringing kind of judgment to like what will eventually derive in value or has the potential of like deriving in value is like more so important than ever. Because there's like the checkbox kind of like kind of to-do list satisfaction to working with agents. Like every once in a while I kind of just brain dead. It's like I just want to go through my list. I don't want to think too hard and just like check, right? And there's something that comes with that with LLMs where it's like, start this conversation, and maybe like 5 or 6 like agents going on, and they're all like doing things, but like,
and they all have checklists that they're checking off as well.
Right. Yeah. So there's something about like kind of the satisfaction and the quick reward associated with that, and that I think like sometimes like get the better of us, right? Or at least like speaking for myself.
How big is the Hookdeck team?
We're at 10 right now.
Oh wow, that's super lean.
Yeah.
Kudos.
It's always been an ambition of mine. I don't think of myself as the best manager, and so I think it's better for everyone that way. No, I'm kind of half kidding. I think like from the get-go, we were kind of born in the midst of COVID, right? Everyone's remote, and there was very much like this mindset from the get-go of kind of hiring, senior kind of experience, like extremely autonomous type people, like to to give a sense of it, like we really just do like a single call every 2 weeks to discuss kind of like product and infrastructure. And so like we try to like very much have this like asynchronous kind of like workflow. And I think it lends itself well to AI use cases too, because like we already hired and optimized for people that like add this autonomy, right? I don't think there's any right or wrong. I'm not gonna like preach for like the way that we do things, but I think it works for us. Definitely works for me and my sanity. So there's that.
I wanted to touch up on the thing you said at the very beginning of the conversation that webhooks are dead. The new way is event gateway. Did you coin that term, or was that somewhere in the ether already? What is an event gateway? I have no understanding of that.
Yeah, we coined it, and it's been very difficult to build a product in kind of like a product category that's not established, because you have the challenges around us like marketing and communication and how you even like describe this thing, right? And for a while we were calling it like webhook management infrastructure and that sort of stuff. Nothing that really rolls off the tongue. So you have the challenge on the communication, but you also have the challenge on the product, because when you're building a product in an existing category, let's say like better stack, usability, you know what you're trying to optimize for. Like your specific USPs you're going for, which in your case, I think a lot of it is around like pricing and DX and that sort of stuff, right? But the point is like the core semantics exists. And so what you're optimizing for is that unique value proposition. When you're building in something that doesn't really exist already, you have to invent the semantic and then also build like a compelling value proposition on top of those semantics, right? So that becomes like very difficult. And that's one learning for the last couple of years, very difficult to build a product in an existing category. And so the idea with Event Gateway and where that came from is trying to like capture as best as we could in, 2 or 3 words that hopefully roll off the tongue, kind of like what it does. And so our goal was to like bridge between event bus and basically API gateways, right? And kind of capture this notion that like gateways are there to as an interface, the interface between like a vendor and your own system and so on, right? And event bus in the sense like this is full blown like event management and queuing and so on, right? So we're trying to like find a term that kind of like marries those two. And really when you think of EventBridge, not too far from Event Gateway. And so really like we want people to like perceive us as like competing with AWS EventBridge, for instance. Like we see ourselves as like a clear alternative to it, right? And so I think the idea around Event Gateway was also to like give a sense of like, look, there are existing products right now. There's no common terminology around those things, right? They don't like outright call it an Event Gateway, but we'll give that a label. And then there's, a couple of already competing product kind of like in that category. One of ours, but then there's AWS, there's Azure, there's others like Kong as an event gateway now, there's Gravity, there's a bunch of like API gateway providers that are kind of like going into event-driven architecture as well. So at this point, there's probably like, half a dozen product at least that would call themselves event gateway or event gateway like. And I don't know if we had anything to do with this, but I can tell you when Kong released their event gateway, I was like, oh shit. Like it was like maybe 2 years in from us like calling it that way. But the part that's like actually rewarding is when customers come to you or like developers come to me and they're like, hey, I'm looking for an event gateway. And it's like, oh, like that's, now you're like, okay, like I think the term is like getting somewhere in terms of like people can like have a mental model what that is, or like trying to like explicitly look for it, or they might say like we're trying to replace our own event gateway. That's things I've like come up to in the conversation. But I can tell you for like the first year that would not come up, and now like as time goes on, it's a term that I see others use like more and more. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for us as a business, but also just like in the sense of like trying to create a set of expectations of like, okay, this is this cloud infrastructure primitive that exists, and yours are like the basic set of expectations that you can have around it. And hopefully at some time, like at some point, like things will start to align in semantic and that sort of stuff too. Like if you're using AWS EventBridge and Hookdeck, like terminology is like very little in common. Now, I don't want to design my product around AWS EventBridge because of all the product that it has. So I'm definitely not going to reuse their terminology if I don't think it makes like, rock solid sense. But I do think like over time, as there's more competition and more people building and people iterate on the product, that sort of stuff, there's probably going to be like some amount of convergence. Yeah.
Do you find if I asked for an event gateway on an LLM that it would recommend you guys?
Oh yeah, try it now. I think the odds are pretty good.
I could try it live.
It's something we track, right?
Yeah,
something we track. We get cited in about like 60% of every single prompt that is around like webhooks or event gateway, that sort of stuff.
That's cool.
And something that we obviously like spend a lot of time on. And as far as our data goes, which might not be at that high quality, we're doing a pretty good job at it. So
It was the first one in the list.
Oh, nice.
there you
That
go.
ChatGPT just gave me, so well done.
Yeah, although I think on Event Gateway, I think we'd probably do just as good on any kind of like webhook related queries and that sort of stuff. But Event Gateway is definitely like kind of playing to our favor in the sense like we coined the term. Like I'd be mad if we weren't first.
I actually now realized I don't actually know what event-driven architecture means. How does it differ from a regular architecture? Like if I slap on a Kafka queue in my system, am I automatically an event-driven architecture?
Yes and no, in the sense that I think when you're talking about event-driven architecture is like more of a set of like paradigm and expectations that you have around it. So part of it is going to be, yes, the tools, right? Like you're using Kafka, you're using message queues or event streaming that are kind of meant to decouple systems. So really when it comes down to it, the idea is they have producers and consumers. Those systems don't need to know about each other, right? So the consumer can consume from a stream of event that can be produced kind of from anyone. And the only real set of expectation that you have is like a contract around what is the event itself, like what is the payload, what is the shape.
Yeah.
And oftentimes there's going to be like schemas, like specific schemas that people will use, like kind of Avro based schemas and Protobuf and other thing, right? Where there's going to be like standardized expectations around what those payloads are and so on. And really, so the contract becomes around, okay, these events exist. And at some point, I might have an event. And as a consumer, my responsibility is to do whatever I'm supposed to do with like a order created or a product update and so on, right? But now an organization that really embrace EDAs, what you'll see is kind of like a systematized kind of pattern around this, right? Where there's going to be like specific guidelines around how you're supposed to do this and what the payload shapes are supposed to be. And it's going to be like an architectural approach where you will intentionally decouple their services and create the communication between those like event driven. Right.
I feel like a lot of companies take like a hybrid approach, right? Something is event driven, but something is not, right? So is the goal to be 100% event driven, or is just like a subset of an architectural paradigm?
I don't think it's 100%. I just think that over time, as you grow and complexity increases and there's more third-party dependencies and so on, it's kind of like the natural way that things tend to go.
Okay.
Because at some point, it's just very difficult to have all those systems coupled, and then you have to think about like the scaling and interdependencies and all that sort of stuff in such a way that makes it pretty difficult. But generally speaking, like when we think of like event-driven architecture in the sense like the term, I think people like think, I mean, rightly so, like think like big enterprise, right? And I think for probably like the first decade of event-driven architecture, it was mainly concentrated in big enterprise. But I think now that's changing, part because of people getting more comfortable with the patterns, in part because Webhooks are a gateway drug to it, and but also like some of the tooling getting better. Like I'm thinking like for instance like the rabbiting queue or like the BullM queue, which is built on Redis, kind of like libraries. There's also like a bunch of popular libraries in Python. There's Celery and Ruby. There's Sidekick. I think there's another one now like Foundation that's also from the folks at Sidekick. So anyway, like there's been like kind of progressive like tooling around that. It also makes it like easier to work with and less intimidating to go into, where you don't necessarily like need big architecture team and big Kafka deployments that cost a bunch of money and so on to kind of like start doing event-driven architecture. But I also think the term has lost a little bit of its meaning. I'm sure some people wouldn't be happy with me saying that, but I do think it's like lost a little bit of its meaning over time, or at least like the water is muddied in terms of what we mean. I think when I say it, what I'm referring to is mainly this decoupling of systems, and then also the programming concerns that you're not going to have as like an engineer in terms of like, having to think about independency and ordering and all those sorts of concern. And so when I say event-driven architecture, it's more I meant like you're now entering into the world where when you build your app, you're gonna have those sets of concern that you didn't have before, right?
Got it.
And being able to like learn and adopt like how you build things to be able to accommodate for those concerns. I don't know if I necessarily mean it in like kind of like the big enterprisey type way. And I think in some sense like what we're doing is trying to like bring that to kind of like everyone in some ways, right? And we're not the only player kind of doing that, right? There's a bunch of other people that are taking a different approach. There's kind of all the workflow engines and step functions there that I think like overlap, like Temporal and Ingest and Trigger.dev and like those folks as well. So I do think it's actually a space where a lot of things are going on, and there's maybe like no real good fixed definition for it anymore. for those that are really interested in kind of like learning more about event-driven architecture and like the paradigms associated with that and so on, there's this guy called David Boyne, who was previously a developer advocate at AWS and actually was working on EventBridge. That's those series of kind of like drawing type explainers, but at this point he probably has like several hundreds. And he also runs a open source project now called Event Catalog. Might be another good podcast guest for you guys. But all that to say, like, he goes in like the amount of depth that's just like is almost unreasonable, right? So definitely recommend those for those that are curious.
Cool. We'll add it to the show notes.
Yeah.
Has all of your knowledge on events and webhooks and everything, because obviously you have quite a lot of it all come from just sort of building Hookdeck, or was there, obviously you said before that you had a few issues with webhooks, but was this when you really dived deep into events?
Very much so. And I think it's like learning that came very much from the problems, but also like first principles in the sense that like when I was dealing with those issues, I didn't actually have a ton of knowledge around it, which was like part of why I was dealing with those issues, right?
Yeah.
So I think it came very much from a place of like, okay, trying to like work through the problem and the solutions of that problem rather than like working through solutions and retrofitting them to the problem, right? But at the end of the day, like at this point, like we've worked with like hundreds of thousands of developers that have like, you know, from all across the spectrum. And so I think I just like soaked up from those conversations. And yeah, I know it's been pretty interesting. I actually started as a product designer originally. So kind of turned, you know, product designer, kind of full stack developer, then like backend developer, then like infrastructure engineer. And now it's like, now kind of like very, very deep down the rabbit hole. But that came through just kind of like working through customers and listening to their concern and reviewing the architecture and all that sort of stuff. But also from the team, right? Like we have people in the team as well that have like a ton of experience working with those systems and also like kind of brought that knowledge to the company. Yeah.
When did you realize you found a market for this? I assume obviously you started working on it and then posted it somewhere, and was it a good reception almost immediately, or has it been quite a sort of slow burn to get people to know this is the better option?
It's slow burn hardly defines it, in the sense that it started with that Medium article I was referring to, right?
Yeah.
Like this kind of like Webhook sucks and there's something you can do about it. I'm like very much like the mindset of like build product for people. And so like the very first version was kind of like a self-service, you know, you could like go in and like create, you know, your first like connection that we call it and all that sort of stuff, and posted this article and stuff. But there's no ambition to like make a business out of it or whatever. It's just like one out of like the 20 other like failed side projects, right? That I kind of like been working on at the time. And I mean, in kind of like retrospective, like now the numbers seems like just ridiculously small because there's maybe 5 people that like reached out from that article or something. But I know for everyone that's like worked on side projects and kind of like been through the motions of trying to like get someone to use something that you've built and so on, like 5 is fucking insane. Like 5 is like better than I probably ever got before, right? And so at times kind of like super excited by it. I was actually like in my camper van in British Columbia rock climbing. Like it's just like very far from, you know, trying to build a startup or whatever. Just kind of like having conversation with those folks, like walking them through it, like what I was thinking and the problem they were having and that sort of stuff. And then kind of like kept trickling in, like maybe one a week, and be like kind of rock climbing, and I like pull up Slack, and it's like the Slack notification. We have this like notification channel for every signups, right? Like the same one that we've had for like 6 years or something. At this point, it's like pretty difficult to even like keep track because it just kind of like scrolls past me. But like we'd have like that. I'd have like that notification in that channel. I'd be like, holy shit, you know, like, you know, someone signed up.
Are you DDoSing Slack?
Oh, no, definitely not in those days.
But right now, you said you still have it right now, so that's why I'm asking.
Right. Well, no, I mean, like things are going well, but I don't think it's to the point of DDoSing Slack.
Okay.
Anyway, so guys, start from there. But I think like the one core assumption at the start that was like problematic was this idea that it's mainly built for observability. I think it's just like wasn't far enough. But once you go from saying like I'm building an observability tool to I'm reinventing a message bus, like suddenly like the scope just like blows open dramatically, right? So I actually kind of met a CTO and co-founder kind of like in the midst of building like the first kind of like queuing engine. And so when kind of like I realized like, okay, like the scope is going to like blow wide open on this. Like that's when we also like went for like a small like pre-seed with like angel investors and that sort of stuff. Right? It's kind of like pre-evident that, you know, it was going to be pretty expensive to build, which turned out it was pretty expensive to build.
And as I understand, you didn't go the typical SF route. You built it in Montreal, right?
Yeah, that's maybe a little bit disingenuous. For what actually happened. So we did a pre-seed about like $400,000 from just angel investors, like no institutional VCs. But then a few months in, we did our Hackers News, and that's really when we kind of knew. Coming back to your question, James, like I think like the response from the Hackers News, like I mean, it wasn't like the biggest Hackers News like show HN ever, but it was like much better than we had like ever expected. And funny anecdote, but I remember this one guy that bought like our $300 plan, right? Like after HN. And I remember like my co-founder and I were like, fuck dude, we made it. You know, like it's a done deal. Like we for sure making it.
Went out for dinner that night, spent it all. It's like more.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? Like the bottle of champagne, and yeah. But yeah. Anyway, so like from that show, HN, that sort of stuff, and then at that point, like we had a bunch of interest from investors, kind of like proactively reaching out and that sort of stuff. And so we did end up like raising a round from Silicon Valley investors, like the firm called Matrix Partners. So we're still based, kind of like decentralized team, like Canadian company. We haven't changed to a Delaware LLC, but at the same point, like I think like our investors have been like tremendous, and I'm like very glad that we did it. And I think like because of COVID and so on too, there's maybe like been growing acceptation of like companies are not like based in a staff and like build remote teams, that sort of stuff. I mean, like a bunch of people have been doing, like we didn't invent anything, like there's the like the Zapier and the GitLab and all those guys that have been like doing this for like way longer than anybody else, right? So I think it just maybe like normalized it. And that's something I've seen like from some, maybe I'm just naive about this, but that's something I've seen from some founders. There's like, you know, as Canadian founders, this big conversation and kind of like Canadian founder Twitter around, you know, incorporating to Delaware, and YC stopped accepting kind of like Canadian companies, and then they ended up like reverting that decision and so on. But there was this kind of like understanding like every investor is going to ask you to become Delaware LLC. And they're right. Every investor is going to ask you. The part that misses that story is that you could just say no. So yeah, for sure they'll ask, like, you know, like why not? And it's easier for them. But turns out if you just say no, it's like also totally fine. So, or at least in my experience and a lot of people that like are kind of like around me and so on. So I think that's a missing part of that story, right? Like at the end of the day, like they're looking, their job is to deploy capital. They're looking for people to invest in. They're looking for original ideas and that sort of stuff. Like I don't want to like argue about the pros and cons of being in a staff, and I'm sure there's like a lot of positive to it. But you know, at the end of the day, like it's your choice as like a founder and a builder, like who you're going to do it with and where you're going to do it with. And I think if you have good ideas and you put the work behind it, like investors will still respect that, or at least some investors will still respect that. Right? And so maybe your job is to find them. But yeah, so I guess it would be disingenuous to say that we are completely outside of that bubble. But like I know personally, you know, made my life here, and you know, I'm pretty glad to still be in Montreal personally.
Well, as a fellow Canadian, it's nice to hear like Canadian success stories. So kudos.
You say
for
that, but then you move to Toronto and then you just like fuck it all up.
Fair.
Can I say as a fellow Commonwealth, like great,
right?
Same king. It's the same thing, you know.
Right. Yeah. We do have the queen. I mean, I don't know if they've updated it to the king now, but we did have the queen on our bill.
Yeah. Was Hookdeck your first startup as a founder, or were there others on the journey that gave you sort of the tools to know how to reach out to investors and find them in a way?
I've always been like very entrepreneurial from like the get-go at this kind of like small companies, like going to like retiree zone, like repairing computers at like 14 or 15 and stuff, right? So I guess in the sense like more like talking to like the entrepreneurial spirit, but no, I think like most of it was like failed side projects, like releasing like a video game that basically never got anywhere. You know, a bunch of other like, at some point I was working on some like social network, despite I'm probably like the worst guy at like social gatherings and like organizing things with friends. Anyway, like kind of went through like the motions of things. I will say though, this experience like at this e-commerce company, it actually like was pretty formative in the sense that I joined as the first employee there, and like was very kind of like involved with like the founding team, and we went from, you know, basically like 4 people to like 40 or something in like 3 years, and you know, all the motion of like building that business and all that stuff there. So I guess like I think of Hookdeck as like very much kind of like the first one, but it'd be like disingenuous to like fully position it as that. I think like there's some like exposure to those things kind of like prior to that. And obviously I had this e-commerce company, like we worked with investors as well, and you know, like the board and that sort of stuff, and like built relationships there as well. And then the first investor actually in that e-commerce business was also our first angel investor in Hookdeck. So it wasn't like kind of fully starting from scratch in the sense that like, you know, some people might find themselves into. But yeah, I guess I still did not expect to be here, you know, a couple of years ago, and that's great.
I saw there's a company called Kiwi Mornings, healthy breakfast startup. What was that all about?
And then your homeworks. So that was one of the failed business along the way. I actually started with my wife. We actually, like, the story goes that my wife was, you know, bringing her breakfast at work, and all the sales guys at work were kind of jealous of her breakfast and started asking her for breakfast. And I was like, what do you mean you're preparing breakfast for sales guys at work? I was like, what is wrong? But then one thing led to another, and she was maybe like making them 5 or 6 breakfasts like every morning for the sales team. And they're like, why don't we, you know, one of those like stupid ideas, like, why don't we make a business out of this? And so we built this like service for basically zero waste breakfast at work. And so we deliver kind of like yogurts and like smoothies and like chia puddings and like that sort of stuff in like little glass jars. And we have like a little fridge in the offices and so on. And me being me kind of took it way too far on like the product and engineering side. Like it was all orders were like through a Slack bot, and like employers could do like have it as an employee benefit where essentially they'd pay like for 50% of the breakfast. And, you know, there's this kind of like this whole thing. And so, yeah, people would order their breakfast through the Slack bot, and all that not necessarily like came to an end. It's just that in that business, like everything goes wrong at 4 a.m. and plus there's no money in food. And so when you combine those two things, it's like very difficult to build a fulfilling business. And then so at some point we ended up kind of like selling the Slack bot and all that, and like kind of stopping doing it. But thankfully that was in January 2021, so like 2 months before COVID. And then basically every equivalent like companies, like there's a lot of them already doing kind of like lunch and that sort of stuff, like office lunch and all that. Basically everybody went out of business. So I think we kind of got a little bit lucky on the timing there, because
Dodged the bullet.
It would have ended no matter what, right? Like, yeah. But all in, I think we probably sold like 20,000 breakfasts or something. I guess it's
pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Oh yeah. So we always like to ask our guests, what are your hot takes about the industry, AI, whatever? Go for it.
I feel like I've given a few already in this conversation, but
I think you have, yeah. What is your hottest take, like burning hot?
Burning hottest take. Okay, this is probably where I'm going to lose you, because it's very much in the weeds of adventure and architecture.
I'm sure some of our audience members will understand what you're saying.
Perfect. So my hottest take is that pull-based consumers, or like pull-based queuing system, are just very dumb compared to push-based system. And the reason why we haven't adopted push-based system is because no queue has built a good push-based system. And the reason why I say this, and now I'll try to give a little bit of context to it, is that when you build kind of queues and consumers, for every queue that you put events in, you need to have a consumer for it. And that consumer might be like some kind of long-running worker that's like pulling off that queue. But the problem is that if you want to dynamically have queues, and so let's say you want to have a queue per customer, right? Because you don't want one customer to like buggle up the whole queue, or each one have their allocated capacity, that sort of stuff. Now you need to have as many consumers as you have queues, which gets insane because you have this like multiplexing problem where each queue needs its consumer. The big advantage with push-based system is that all those queues can push to the same consumer. And so that one consumer can be like an API with a load balancer in front of it that you can scale horizontally or vertically, whatever. But the point is like you can do that completely decoupled from how many queues you actually have. And I think one thing that we're seeing is like once you get into like more and more complex use cases, you end up with like more and more granular ways that you want to queue things. So you want to queue per topic and per specific conditions and per customer and that sort of stuff. And it gets like completely insane because then you have like 100 queues and 100 consumers and 100 Delaware queues and like all the mess that comes around with this. But it's very difficult today to find push-based message queues. And the reason for this is because you're shifting where the throughput is being controlled. If the throughput is being controlled in the consumer, each consumer is responsible for saying, hey, I want 50 message per second or concurrently or whatever. And then how many messages you're consuming becomes what's the capacity of a worker, how many workers do you have, and also what's the effective capacity. It's not because you say you want 50 per second that it's actually going at 50 per second, because it depends on all the rest of the code and whether or not it's fast enough and so on, right? So I think the reason why we haven't moved to Bush-based queues is that most of them don't actually give you the necessary granularity in controlling throughput. So for instance, like GCP PubSub does have a push mode, but in push mode, they basically like ramp up the rate at which they send you requests until your API starts to slow down, which at this point, they basically have degraded it. And then once it starts to slow down, then they ramp back down the delivery rate. And so what you end up with is that it creeps up, server crash or has serious performance degradation, goes all the way back to 0, and then creeps up, goes all the way back to 0. And it's just like completely dumb. Like, it makes no sense, right? And I think if you build push-based message queues, and that's like one of the quests I'm in, where you have very fine-grained control over the throughput and the exact behavior of the consumption rate, it simplifies so much of your architecture. So that's a hot take for the people that knows. But ill I'm willing to die on.
I mean, like, I didn't understand all of it, but it sounded reasonable, you know?
I think if you did understand that, go check out Hookdeck.
Yeah, exactly.
Appreciate that, yes.
Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Better Stack podcast. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere else. But today, it's a goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me.